Ben Simmons gets back surgery. This is unfortunately following the pattern for the Brooklyn Nets of situations and circumstances that make it hard to get clarity on what it looks like for this championship caliber team going forward. We break down the timeline, the general reporting on this during the season, and what it will mean as we work our way towards training camp. All coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. Oh, yes, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings and FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Arbrecht, breaking down the one giant podcast, New York Football Giants Intel, with my boy Andy Makowitz. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We're free on all those great platforms. And, of course, let you know today's episode is brought to you by betonline.net. BetOnline has you covered for all season long with props, odds, and more lines than ever before. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. Doug, we prepare to dive in on what will never be a boring offseason for the Brooklyn Nets. Ben Simmons gets back surgery, and now we get to kind of look back and forward. No, Jesus, no pun intended there, on what this will mean for the Brooklyn Nets.
Yeah, man. So it comes out late last week, and we got crossed up a little bit with our podcasting schedule because we had Chris Mahalan, awesome, for a couple podcasts, and then we recorded another one about the trade stuff. So it kind of got caught in between here, as sometimes will happen in the offseason. That's just the way it is. That Ben Simmons was going to undergo microdiscectomy back surgery to clear up some of the pain that he's been experiencing or had been experiencing over the latter part of the season related to the herniated disc. So this is, and we'll go through some of the nuts and bolts here, but when I'll start by saying when you hear back surgery, it's like, okay, good, right? We can hone in on what exactly it might be the exact problem that he was suffering from, sure. Right? Because there was clearly something going on here. And then two, you start to work when you start hearing back and surgery, that's can send you a little bit far afield on what that actually means for, the long-term kind of stuff. But, from the Nets perspective, at least this piece there's some clarification here on what the actual problems are, and the doctors in this case thought that a surgery was warranted. So we'll go through some of the timelines and recovery and what that looks like. But for starters, that's what it is. He did have the resurgery already. He's already had left the hospital. It's a pretty quick procedure, I believe. He was posted on it on social media within 24 hours of him just driving home saying he was feeling okay. So, I mean, this is from that perspective, you feel, I guess positive about it, but I guess, we can start talking about what it means for the Nets and how it how it frames sort of how this situation has gone with Ben Simmons.
Yeah, I mean, you immediately cast your mind back, right, to things unravel with James Harden. He wants out. The Nets make that call. We don't have to re-go down that road. They make the trade. You bring in a player, and then you're left with this mystery. And I mean, high level, this is not the Hardy Boys. It's supposed to be the Brooklyn Nets, like NBA basketball team playing for championships. Instead, there always is, and it's not of their own doing, but there always does seem to be a level of, so what do you think that's going to look like going forward? Or what do we suppose this might be, right? And there's numerous situations to point to here. We know what they are, from Kyrie Irving, even to just, little snippets from Kevin Durant at times you want to over dissect because of the way this team has gone over the last 3+ seasons. And this is going to extend that timeline now into a little bit more of a mystery. Do you look back at the way Ben Simmons, the way it was reported, the way his people reported it, the way the Nets reported it, and hold anyone to some type of standard around it? Or because I kind of maybe end up coming back to, as we talked about before we got on, of maybe this is actually why it was so confusing and difficult to have real clarity on this since the trade happened and Ben joined Brooklyn.
Yeah. Okay. So real quick, before I even answer that, just one more bit of clarification here. What the microdiscectomy procedure is basically, which we did on Thursday, is essentially it's an invasive procedure in that it does go in and it's meant to relieve the pain around a herniated disc. it'll remove like bone or other pieces or whatever part of the disc bulging is there that is like essentially, theoretically putting strain on your back into those vertebrae. So I'm not a doctor. This is what we just read about. So if I messed up a piece of that, feel free to clarify. I feel like I have some idea what's happening here, but that essentially is what it is. It's a procedure meant to go into the back to, if there's swelling or other pieces that are pushing up against your back or spine that is causing you pain, this is meant to remove it. That I think is the layman's terms for what's happened here. From that perspective, it lends clarity to around why the back was such an ongoing issue for times. And backs can be debilitating and there can be spiraling effects. We'll talk about that in a little bit around what can happen. I think it at least, I'll say the part where, I think there was some people out there that questioned, whether let me put it this way. Maybe this is what you're trying to get at. I think there were some people that questioned whether this thing was even like what was actually happening with Ben Simmons. We had no idea. Is it a mental health? Is it whatever's going on? Is it other? She's talked about mental health. So I'm not even putting words in anyone's mouth there. Like they've mentioned this as a prime piece of, his struggle to get back on the court. When surgery becomes an option, there at least is a piece of it that says, hey, this is something that a doctor saw on an MRI. And there's clearly some kind of issue happening here. So I think that many Nets fans that were going conspiracy theory on what Ben Simmons' motivations were at the end of the season, I think that probably lays that part to rest. How it was handled, it's so hard to tell because I don't think that these surgeries are necessarily like one-to-one, your ankle's broken, you just need to get your ankle fixed, R.I.P. Joe Harris, or like you just have, or your Achilles tendon is torn, Kevin Durant, you have to get surgery. I do think there's probably a part of this that lies a little in between where it would say it can kind of get a little worse over time, right? And so what seemed like it was going to be an okay situation to start, or maybe at a physical even, can sort of worsen over time due to a variety of other factors that make it slightly different of an injury than like those one-to-one things that we've seen many basketball players get. Many basketball players have torn their ACLs. Many basketball players have torn the MCLs. Many basketball players have needed Achilles surgeries, and on and on and on. These are common basketball injuries. The microdiscectomy and herniated disc piece is not a common basketball injury, and I think that there's at least clarifies some of the timelines around why this was confusing for the Nets even in the moment.
Yeah, and I think it probably also does clarify if you take it from Ben Simmons' side and from the Nets side, not that they're on opposite sides of this situation, but the idea of if you look at it from a player perspective, any injury, regardless back or otherwise, they want to get back out there and play. So when you hear the reports, he's trying to ramp up, he's playing, one on none, he's playing a little bit of 4-on-4, like he's trying to get there. But then for however Nets fans feel about Steve Nash right now in this moment, at the time when Steve Nash was asked about it, he was very vague, right? He was, well, we'll see. And we know how the Nets are around injuries in general, but that might be the cautious side of the team saying, listen, like there's a back problem here. We don't 100% know if it's going to get worse or if it's manageable, and setting any level of expectation of like, yeah, he's ramping up, we're going to have him back. Like there was never a time when the Brooklyn Nets announced any timeline around him returning, even into the playoffs. That was all reported about what potentially could happen here. And in that sense, like to your point, I know fans, once you see something come in, the trade happens, you want to see the one-to-one replacement and you want to feel like there's still opportunity here. But that's where I think we, or sports fans or sports people covering sports, get caught in the minutia of there is all the things of, well, if he can, then this, right? Then when, or if he plays, how does he fit in? And then you bring it all the way back and go, we don't know if he can or not though, right? And everything else becomes speculative, and it's easy to kind of pile on narratives that build an idea around expectations, as opposed to he came in, had a back situation, unsure about what it was going to mean, and neither he nor the team was really willing to give hard commitments around expectations.
Sure, and sometimes with sports too, well, I
got frustrated while saying that.
Think about situations where surgery is an option, but you delay it because there's a chance you can stay on the court or get back on the court, right? We've seen this multiple times too. We're watching it play out right now with Joel Embiid. Joel Embiid needs surgery on his thumb. If they believe it's not going to get worse, and they have said, we will just wait to have surgery until the season is over, because then we know there will be no more basketball to be played, right? It's not going to get necessarily
for right now.
Right. There's something to play for. So, and the surgery will make the decision right away, right? If we don't need, if we can push the decision back a little bit because it might get better, or it's manageable, or whatever the story is. We've seen this happen multiple times where it's like Kyrie Irving went through this with his shoulder, right? It's like, hey, I'm gonna delay surgery because I might be able to recover, right? This is a couple years ago. So there are many examples of surgery being delayed until the season is in a definitive state, which is to say it's over. So now I know that there's nothing to play for. So now I can, any hemming or hawing makes it sound like it's trivial. It's not. Any decision I had to make around this is now made a little easier because there's nothing to ramp up and play for, right?
Yeah.
And so,
including Seth Curry with his ankle. I'm not saying he's going to need surgery, but he was managing something predicated on the idea that there's a chance for us to win games
Correct.
here, and I can be a part of that, unlike a back situation.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's the other part too, where sometimes like, oh, now he gets the back surgery. You're like, yeah, well, now he gets it because there's no more basketball, right? Like it's not just, this isn't some, we don't need to look at the Zapruder film of him on the basketball court to see if he needed surgery 3 weeks ago. It's now there's no more basketball to be played. Yeah. And so whatever. I'm not even saying the surgery is correct or not. I'm just saying why this timeline would make a little more sense, because we've seen other examples. Again, I just gave many examples of this happening just with other body parts. Okay. I do want to talk about some comps here with this surgery, other basketball players and athletes that have had it in the past. Not the most encouraging list in the world, but we will talk about that in a second. We'll also talk about what this means for some of the other guys on the Brooklyn Nets. And as we gear up to the offseason, first going to talk to you about our friends over at Bet Online, betonline.net, your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. I look at betonline.net every single day. I've been rolling through it really specifically with the baseball lines as we roll through baseball season. Super helpful when you're putting together projection systems like I do on a daily basis. BetOnline is one of the best, if not the best source for this kind of information. They have you going through the basketball playoffs as well. Maybe get that Kentucky Derby action, run for the roses. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, live betting, playoffs, esports, and more. Head on over to betonline.net. You can track all of the trends and all of the action like I do on a daily basis. BetOnline, where the game starts.
And of course, you make the Locked On Nets podcast your first listen of the day. Make that second listen the Locked On NBA Big Board. Its host, Rafael Barlow from NBA Draft Junkies and author of the NBA Big Board newsletter, joined by Rich Stamen, Sam Ferris, and Leah Thulin, as they are giving fans an in-depth look at the NBA draft, mock drafts, player rankings, and of course, big boards. It's free and available wherever you get your podcast needs fulfilled. So then we turn our attention to how will this injury impact Ben going forward, right? Because now this is where you're doing the both and. Listen, you're happy to get the trade done. You're watching James Harden in the playoffs. You're hoping it doesn't look so good because you don't want to pay that guy the big money in the offseason. Ben Simmons is in. Okay, he's not going to be available right now. Fine. Push the pause button. Surgery in the offseason. And what does this timeline look like? And how much, it's like, and now we already know. We're going to be in another state of question if you're a Brooklyn Nets fan heading into this offseason and looking towards next year, because Ben Simmons is a key piece to what they're supposed to accomplish.
Yeah, well, in very Brooklyn like Brooklyn kind of examples, because they're bad at this. They actually just released a very definitive statement around what was happening here. So, shocker of the season to just get an actual injury update. Go ahead. What are you going to say?
Well, I'll rebuke that immediately, because they do give a very definitive timeline, and it's so far out that they can go ahead and revise that timeline as it approaches. Fair. This is the very glowing, like, hey, he'll be back. You'll give the specifics that he'll be back for training camp. But then, by the way, a month out from training camp, 3 weeks from training camp, they could say, well, yeah, tentative training camp. We'll see how it plays itself out.
By the way, if you hear Adam and I sort of like talking with this tone around Brooklyn Nets injury reporting, you must be new to the podcast / new to Nets world. This is just not an us thing. This is a very known thing, that the injury stuff with the Nets has been totally brutal. Maybe it improves. I don't really know. It hasn't been like this forever, but the last couple of seasons have been horrible with just in terms of outward face. They need not, but outward facing information and being able to trust the timelines. It's just, look, we've been beaten in this submission with this stuff. Anyway, the timeline for Simmons is 3 to 4 months right now. That would put him back in line to be able to start training camp basically at full throttle. He'd have to work back into it, but they have given a timeline that has said, this is the 3 to 4 month timeline. Again, that's a 1 month difference is big when it's only 4 months, because it's a 25% difference. Sometimes people forget that part of, 1 month is different. A 1 month difference over 20 years is like, you're getting pretty close. 1 month over 4 months is, the percentages start to skew a little bit. So but they, that is the timeline. It does put him back in terms of training camp, theoretically, like, what they're saying. So that part is at least encouraging. I would say the one part that's not encouraging, if you want to hear the list of the few other players that I was able to find that have had microdiscectomy surgery.
Doug.
Yeah. So it's not funny. This is serious stuff. It's funny because in only Nets fashion, we're getting stuff that doesn't happen to a lot of basketball guys.
Yeah.
So again, this isn't an ACL. This is an MCL. We know how this stuff works. Michael Porter Jr. from the Denver Nuggets had this coming out of college. He has had 2 procedures since and sat out most of the season with, I believe it was a back issue this year. I'm not saying it's related to it. I'm just saying this is one of the few other players that has had this procedure that I could find. Michael Dunleavy Jr. a bunch of years ago, 6 years ago at this point, that was at the tail end of his career, so a little bit different. He was in his mid-30s. I was probably not going to hang on for too much longer, no matter what, I would say. He had this procedure and basically played like 20 games after total. And so that's kind of the list. Tiger Woods has had the surgery in the past. He had it back in January of last year. We obviously saw, he played in the Masters this year. So, this is stuff that you can, high performance athletes have had it. But my main point is the list is fairly small here. This is not your standard basketball injury. And I don't know, when you hear that kind of list, and hey, hit me up, by the way, if you know of others. I try to research this as much as possible. It's not totally crystal clear around what back procedures or what sometimes with the reporting, but if you have others, like, definitely throw them out there, throw them in YouTube comments. But what do you hear? What do you think when you hear this kind of list? Like, is it like, oh, the procedure's not that big of a deal, he's already home in a day or two and he's fine, or does it point to like other bigger problems? I had trouble kind of figuring out where I stood with other comps on this kind of thing.
Yeah, in some ways, I think the reason why you don't hear about more examples is because back injuries. You were saying before about timelines. It's like, well, I could tweak something in my back. I'm not talking about surgery. Like, I could hurt myself, and guess what? I can roll myself into the chair, get the microphone in front of me, and do a podcast with you, right? Like, there's different expectations around what you need to do predicated on an injury, and the back is not something that you said before. It's not a 1-to-1. Your ankle is broken. We can fix the ankle. We can put pins in there, and then you just need to work back up to playing shape. The secondary,
unless you're Joe Harris, but go ahead.
Right, yeah, right, and then you'll be totally fine. Which, by the way, to get into that, to get our previous episode and the way that conversation went on YouTube was fun. We had fun. But when it comes to the secondary element of this is when it comes to the back, there was also, as you said earlier, the very clearly communicated from Ben Simmons, he was having some issues around mental health, and these two things are not unrelated in terms of stress. Like, the stress impact around the back and having issues with it is a very clear correlation. And so I guess my concern, first of all, I'm not alleviated by hearing that there's not a lot of examples of this in the NBA. And then the secondary concern is he's going to get surgery. This tends to be that when you get surgery on your back, you end up getting more surgeries. That's usually the way you hear people speak about it. Again, not a doctor, but if he now has to go onto a recovery timeline, what does that look like for someone who may also be dealing with other stresses beyond the injury, beyond his back, and the way that could impact it? And that is very real and very concerning, and totally understandable that it could take much longer than 4 months. There's just not going to be any clarity around this until you start to get a sense of how he's feeling, not only around the injury, but also how he's feeling mentally around the injury.
Yeah, look, this is just not us saying this either. I go to Spine Health Web, and I read up a bunch of this. Like, this is things we've heard, but then wanted to make sure we confirmed. We did look at some other medical websites and talked about stress and back pain and stuff like that. It's not just us spouting this off. This is a clear thing. Like I said, Spine Health, which is, apparently something of an authority around this stuff, talks extensively about how stress can play on a back to the point where people will need surgery. It's not, this is not necessarily a 1-to-1 with Simmons, but there are times where back-related pain can be from non-impact things, right? Like, there's, unlike, again, like an ankle surgery where it's clear, like, hey, your ankle's dislocated, it's twisted sideways, we can see it, right? Like, this is, or there's very clearly your ACL is gone, right? Like, it needs to be reconstructed. Backs are a little bit more ambiguous at times, and again, I'm just quoting from doctors here, it can be related to stress. I only say this because Ben Simmons has been on record as saying that stress was part of this, right? Like this, or at least through his representatives, that there was a mental health component to this. that's the only part where I'm not concerned, but I think you'd be remiss to not mention it, because
Yeah.
it just is something that is documented, again, through doctors. Maybe he would even admit that was part of it, because backs can debilitate and spiral in a way that other injuries can't, that aren't as clear cut, right? Like a disc bulging. I've had a disc bulge before and a herniated disc. I'm not comparing myself to Ben Simmons. I'm just saying two different people had two different opinions of my back. I'll put it there. I had a herniated disc in the past. I needed physical therapy. I had two different, well, maybe three different experts give me three different, totally different courses of action for this one thing. In a way, I've broken both my ankles also. Everyone agreed what to do with the ankle, right? Like there was
Hey, watch out for Mr. Glass over here.
there was no one that was telling me to walk it off, right? Like there was no doctor that was telling me to just walk the ankle off. In a herniated disc situation, there were differing opinions. No one hates the podcast guy comparing himself to the professional athlete more than me, believe me, and I'm definitely not doing that. I'm only mentioning it to say, to lend credence to the idea that there's a little more ambiguity around this particular injury than there are others. And I want Ben Simmons to make a full recovery, and I really hope he can, but it's just hard to figure this one out compared to Kevin Durant tears his Achilles. It's a 18-month timeline, right? Like it's just different.
And that's the one piece. It's also because you say about certain injuries, again, a little bit of research knowledge around it, a little information around it, not knowledge. I'm not an expert on this stuff, but the idea of you can be recommended surgery or you can be recommended physical therapy, right? Like there could be three different versions.
I'll put it this way. I was recommended surgery, physical therapy, and nothing. Those are the three recommendations I got. That's a pretty wide spectrum.
And by the way, and then if you're an NBA player, if you're an athlete at the highest level, well, your decision tree looks a little bit different, because I can't necessarily take the do nothing route, see if it handles itself on its own. Right. I could be sitting here 3 months from now having someone say, well, that didn't work out. Now let's go for the surgery, right? So you do also have a bit of a timeline restraint around it if you're Ben Simmons and you're talking about your professional career and all of those things. So we'll see how it plays out. Obviously, as you said, he had the surgery. That's the positive. It looks like the recovery timeline is in the right direction. Hopefully, we get updates as the offseason progresses for Brooklyn. That gives us positive indication that things are going well and that Ben Simmons feels good about having had the surgery and maybe feeling some relief around this issue that he had been dealing with going all the way back to his time in Philadelphia. Coming up here in a second, we're going to talk about what this means from a high level for the Brooklyn Nets going into this offseason. There are a lot of potential decisions to be made. Does this impact how Sean Marks and Brooklyn looks to address areas of need this off season? We'll break that down right after we talk to you about our friends over at Built Bar. That's because we know summer is coming. And if it's summertime and you're out there putting on your Speedos, we all know Doug has them in the closet. You want to look good. You want to be fit. And that's why you reach for a Built Bar. You throw them into your towel bag when you hit the beach. You give them to your kids as well so that they're getting those jolts of energy and also giving you that boost to make you feel good, like you can get out there and be in great shape this summer. Built Bar is, of course, covered 100% real chocolate, not just the Built Bars, but also the first of their kind Puff Bars, which are protein-infused marshmallow bars, also covered in 100% real chocolate. And when we talk about only having 130 calories, just 4 grams of sugar, only 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein, you know it's the better, healthier, tastier option than 240 calories from a candy bar or 30 grams of sugar. I don't think so, friends. You go to Built.com right now, get all your favorite flavors from banana cream pie, raspberry, double chocolate, and so many more. You go to Built.com and use promo code LOCK15, and you'll get 15% off on your order. That's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at Built.com. So, Doug and I do show rundowns, and we talked about getting into the nitty-gritty, some of the very specific things around how this impacts players and what the Nets want to do. But over the course of the show, Doug, I've taken a little bit of a light step back. Let's go bird's eye view here. If the Brooklyn Nets were thinking about doing things this offseason, re-signing certain players, we'll get into it more as the week goes on here, or waiting and seeing, right? Trading players, looking at the market. How much do we look at this Ben Simmons situation and say, well, this could ratchet up what Sean Marks feels like he needs to do? Because remember, this is not Ben Simmons 3 to 4 months from now being ready for training camp. This is 3 or 4 months from now, plus the year that he didn't play in Philadelphia, right? This guy is going to be away from basketball for a very long time. I I'm kind of caught in between about whether or not I think this makes the Nets go, all right, we have to wait and see here before we commit to making any real decisions, or we operate on the premise that he will be back this upcoming season and we make our decisions based around that.
It doesn't probably help clarify anything. I think that the one thing that helps, I mean, and this probably isn't surgery related, is that you knew Simmons was under contract, and with the surgery, you can't trade him. So like even any hope that I'm not even saying they wanted to, but even any part where they entertained trading him at all in this offseason, the surgery wipes that off the map. So at least from that standpoint, I don't think you're even bothering exploring those options. So
Right.
I guess from a clarity standpoint, that works. I think at this point with the Nets and with the Simmons situation, just to start, you have to just go in with the idea that he's going to be healthy and ready to play, because I don't know if there's a wishy-washy way to handle this offseason no matter what. I don't think, because you're not going to ship pieces off and try to, you're not tanking, let's say, right? We know that that's not the case.
You can't totally reconfigure the roster on a premise that he won't be around to then end up with maybe a weird roster that you don't know what to do with certain guys.
Right, exactly. It doesn't affect the Kyrie negotiations even in a little bit. Like whatever their decision was going to make, I don't think that like that piece matters at all for Kyrie. I think you just do whatever you wanted to do, good, bad, or otherwise with Kyrie. So I don't think that matters. I guess there are a few probably role player pieces to this that you wonder about. And I just think the Nets just need certain types of players anyway, and they're Simmons independent. And so I don't really think it changes much. I think that it makes it less certain because you're probably sitting more on pins and needles now around, like you said, the timelines now are so far out there. This will have been, like you said, years where he has not played, year plus where he has not played basketball and is coming off an invasive surgery. And so, but I just don't know how it changes any of the other pieces, except to say, I hope you can do nothing except for say, I hope he makes a full recovery and is back to Ben Simmons 2020, right? Like other than that, what else is to be done? You know what I mean? I guess you kind of hedge a little bit, but the players you would hedge with are players you needed anyway. So I just don't know what it sucks. There's no clarification, I think, here. I mean, unless you see something different than which you might, I don't know.
No, I mean, when you think about just from a roster construction standpoint, we know the Nets want to get bigger this offseason if they can. They know that they want to have more. They'd like to get one or two, if you want to count, look at Kessler Edwards and say that he's going to be a part of what they do next year. You need 3 and D wing help, right? Like, so there's certain things that you were going to want to get no matter what. Right. Even if Ben Simmons wasn't even on this roster, you'd say, well, we'd like to add these pieces. And then maybe we want another, we want a functional big. Now, the way you think you can go about winning a championship when it comes to playoff basketball, because you and I have talked so much about some of these guys going back to DeAndre Jordan days, right? These are inning eaters, right? We need some of those during the regular season. Now, I'll be curious if the Nets have fundamentally shifted on that. And we can get into that as well this offseason around their approach to how to get through the regular season and make it to the playoffs versus maybe we need to think about guys during the year that can also carry over to the postseason. But yeah, by and large, probably the biggest impact to me is going to be, right, wrong, and different is going to be trade deadline during the season, right? Because you'll get a sense in training camp where Ben is. Then you'll see how it looks as the season gets underway. And if it isn't going well, then you can make a big swing in a different direction potentially. Or you can say, yeah, this worked out. What is another supplemental piece? So maybe it just pushes the timeline back a little bit here. But to your point, I think there are marginal moves. We haven't gotten into the trade exemptions yet that the Nets are going to be able to make here this offseason that with or without Ben Simmons is going to make them a better team behind Kevin Durant and presumably, as we all know, behind Kyrie Irving, right?
And they only have so many bullets to fire here. It's not like the Nets are sitting here with this wealth of options in terms of where they can go either between the salary cap, the lack of draft picks, and the just players that they already have on their contract and players they're going to need to replace. It's not like they're going to be, I don't think they weren't going to be taking,
right?
They weren't going to be taking any big swings here anyway. Right. And so I just don't think, and that's where and that's kind of where I mean, it's not going to affect things too much. They need to absolutely crush the margins once again. They've been in the past very good at that. I would say the last season they were not good at it. Some of it was bad luck, right, for sure. But a lot of players that they brought in just didn't pan out the way they thought they were. I'm only evidenced by how many they cut, right? Like how many they ended up just flat out releasing before it was all said and done. And so like, that's not right. So I'm not even that's not even like an X's and O's evaluation of it. It was like a lot of the guys that they brought in the offseason last year just weren't on the team by the end of the year because they let them go.
Yeah.
So they're going to need to do really well along those lines. I don't think it changes again, like the kind of player that they need to bring in. The bigger problem is how many of those players actually exist. That's actually the bigger thing. I would not wholesale. The one thing I'd probably be, remiss to do would be like something going back to what we talked about with Curry and Harris, right? And saying if I need to like make a swing for the fences move because I'm going to trade these like maybe arguably valuable pieces like Curry, who I think I would just retain them at that point, right? And just say, hey, this is like a known quantity for us. We know what Seth is at 8 million. He's very, very, very good. Harris is coming off surgery, so like it's going to be tough even if you wanted to. I think I would probably in those cases just stand pat, right? And just say, I just need to live with what it is because that's where I am. And to put myself even more in flux would be a problem. I think that would be the one probably change I would make from the last podcast, which I would say like, this does not make me want to do any other question mark moves because we got too many question marks as it is.
Yeah, just to your point, you so many guys, Javon Carter and Membry, and then even cutting James Johnson out right there to keep Kessler on the postseason roster. Like these were players that good Lord, Millsap, you forget about him because he never even got stepped on the court for all those reasons. So certainly mistakes were made in that regard from Sean Marks and who they brought in. But you're probably right. Again, when we talk about Joe Harris and Seth Curry, the number one option probably is just to have these guys on the roster. And if they can be healthy in there, then you know how good those players can be together around all these superstars. And maybe that does further push that idea of, okay, let's see. Like what do we, there's a handful of players we have in the building that we very clearly know what they are and we know what they're capable of for us. Let's go ahead and make sure that they're still here. And then because introducing another question mark is maybe something that 3+ years into this journey, you just don't want to have to do, already understanding the biggest one has been thrust upon you with Ben Simmons, the back injury and the surgery and what he'll look like when he comes back. So
yeah. This team's just one big question mark. It's like the Brooklyn question mark Nets. This team has been nothing but a question mark. And by the way, and just to go, and we'll wrp this up here, but
Brooklyn Riddlers.
This just takes me back to the people. The one comment I won't really understand is the out, like, I mean, and great for you if you think like this. I guess I'm just not that guy. I'm built different. But the person that's like, that clears it up. He's going to be that clears it up. He's going to be good to go for next season. Now all questions answered. That's the person I'll never understand. I've seen many people like this. I'm like, what on earth would give you? It's not even Simmons related. It's just Nets related. What on earth would give you this just clarity and optimism around the team that has done very little in the goodwill department when it comes to that? That's the one that I just can't. Well, I'm cautiously optimistic that he's better. The part where, hey, wipe our hands with it. Good to go. How do you? I don't even know where you come up with that thought. That's the only one I'll never understand.
Yeah, I was just going to say, cut from the same cloth here, because when we were talking about doing this episode, at no point was I like, now, when do you want to hit on how awesome this is for Brooklyn going forward and how they've answered they solved a problem around this piece now with the surgery for Ben Simmons. Everything.
My reaction is the opposite. My reaction is the opposite. It was like, back surgery? That sucks.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, no, I could not imagine going, hey, so, I mean, game one, huzzah, right? All the big three will be out there. Like, no, we're so much further away from that than we've ever been at this point now.
100%. So. You're definitely 100%. Like anytime that's it. It's very crystal to me. Okay. We're going to get out of here. Aforementioned YouTube, go over, give us subscribe over on YouTube. See those numbers continue to climb. People love the offseason content. So go and join over there on YouTube. Make sure you also download and like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, totally free on both platforms. Obviously, it really helps put a little wind in our sails. So subscribe on YouTube, like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hey, I'm coming back. Write it down in big letters. I'm not going out like this. Mariano Rivera.
Ooh, Enter the Sandman, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.